question. And what that always means is that it's a bit harder than the engineering itself. For example, what one often does require is a corporate that buys a startup's product before it even has 50 enterprise customers, which is exactly what our next speaker spent years studying. In fact, I think you spent your past years was tracking over 400,000 corporate startup relationships. 400,000, my God, have you slept actually in the last 5 years? With that, to tell us exactly what separates the ones that create real value from the ones that end up going nowhere after the pilot project is none other than the CEO of Glassdoor, Fabian Dudek.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for taking the time, and I'm going to do my best to make it really valuable for you. I think generally we can probably all agree that when you hear corporate startup collaboration, it's like, yeah, I've heard about that topic like for the last 20 years. All the consultants have sold it to me, and I think that we are talking about it since so long is showing that the topic is relevant, but I think the way that we're talking about the topic is at a too granular level. The way that those stories are typically being told is, hey, remember when Apple and Adobe worked together and Apple managed to create a much better product than they could have themselves? And that partnership, of course, was a really important one. But I think the element that we're missing is one level above. How many of these collaborations are actually happening? And how do the corporations that do this very well achieve to orchestrate all of this? And so, like has been rightly introduced, we started asking ourselves these questions of, okay, if we go beyond the individual anecdotes and look at a meta level, how many of those collaborations are actually happening? Who are the ones that are most actively engaging with companies? Can we maybe even see that those companies that most actively collaborate with startups are financially more successful than others that don't? Are there certain sectors that are more active than others where maybe we can learn something from them? All of those are questions that I'm looking to at least give you a glimpse into some answers that hopefully you can take with you into your own work of how you systematize the collaboration with startups. Now, what we've done, there are different numbers flying around. I'm going to show you different analyses. Some are from half a year ago, some are more recent. That's where you see the difference between the 250,000 startup corporate relationships that we collected versus 400,000. Generally, at Glassdoor, we help corporations. By now, it's more than 100 to work together with startups. So we've enabled a few thousand POCs ourselves, have a lot of knowledge from that. But that's just a fraction of what's actually happening. A data set that we've collected is basically we built a little Google for startups where we check all press releases, all case studies, all reference customers that are mentioned on startup websites, and created a massive data set that allows us to quantitatively answer these questions. Yeah? Now, first things first, who are the ones that are most actively working together with startups? Now, you see the top 10 here, and there's a lot that we can already infer from that. One element that I want to highlight here is not so much which are these companies, but much more how many startups are these guys working with. Now note, these are publicly announced collaborations. There's a large dark number in that. Most likely it's 4, 5, 10, maybe 20x the number of collaborations that actually happened that never got published. And you see that even the ones in the lower top 10, we're still talking about thousands of startups that we have found mentioning that they work together with, for example, Siemens. Think about that. Close to 2,000 startups say they work together with Siemens. Do you think it's possible for an innovation team, even if they had 20 people, to enable those 2,000 collaborations? No, right? I'm actually going to invite in a second the head of startups at Siemens to talk about how many of those do they actually know? Let me already foreshadow. Whenever we share this data with corporations we work with, very often they're very surprised about many of the companies that are in there. Because in the end, the reality is motivated business units themselves independently go out and try to look for new solutions. Now, another analysis that we could do, and this is the first time actually that we can put real numbers to this, is we plotted the most active corporations working with startups against the general pool of Fortune 500s. And we looked at, are the ones that are more actively working together with startups financially more successful than those that don't? Now note, this is not a causation. This is just a correlation for now. But it is a first step to actually show in boardrooms and at the highest level, look, we're not just doing this to be cool, to brand ourselves as innovative. No, the companies that are actively doing this are significantly outperforming those that are not doing it. And you see here it's 40 percentage points over the last 5 years. So that's significant. Another analysis that is possible is if we now segment all of those corporations into the different spaces. Now here, because we're at DTM, we took the sector definition that DTM uses for its different corporations. And we see on the left side, okay, what is actually the distribution of partnerships we found across the different spaces? And we see at the top manufacturing, which I feel also like to those in the startup ecosystem, there's a lot happening there, right? You hear about new programs. There are a lot of companies that are doing things. But then actually, if we break it down on an individual corporate level, we see that manufacturing corporations, in fact, actually are by far not as active as there are many other, or as are other corporations that are part of smaller spaces. For example, computing. Now, figuring out why is that, we can come up with many hypotheses, of course, right? In computing, it's tendentially software heavier. Testing out software solutions is much easier than if you're trying hardware or if you have big security requirements like you, for example, have in manufacturing. Nonetheless, I think this provides a lot of insights also from this framing of, hey, we're here to strengthen European deep tech, and I think it's not we don't just need to do or cannot just do that within one industry, but we can also learn from each other and learn from what are maybe corporations in computing and space doing differently, and maybe there are some manufacturing companies, for example, that can take some inspiration from how these guys have actually managed to make it so easy to test new solutions. Now, there's a lot more that we theoretically could get into. There's a whole report we wrote, we created on this that at the end, there's going to be a link and a QR code. It's available for free and probably going to help many of you in your arguments internally for these types of programs. But in order to now take this a level deeper, I would love to invite Daniel, head of startup for Siemens, to come on stage to talk to me a little bit about how Siemens managed to work with over 1,700 startups and how the system exactly works. Thanks very much, Daniel, for being here.
Nice to meet you. Should we sit down?
Shall we sit down? Let's sit down.
I'm going to invite myself to sit.
So, exactly as I said before, 1,700 startups that where there's public information that they work together with you. That's a crazy number. How does that compare to the ones that you know about? And how does your setup look like in order to actually achieve and moderate such an enormous portfolio?
I think it's super interesting that every time you publish this, and I think it's the second time that you publish this report, we can't wait for it to get it there because we want to compare it to what do we actually have in our databases versus what else is out there. And then we kind of start looking at what are the teams that are working here. The thing, sorry, I'm going to fix this quickly. The thing that we kind of figured out is, as a corporate, we do so many different things. Like Siemens is a company that we have such a huge portfolio. There's so many things we're working on. We don't just have one product, not that corporations often have, but we have so many different things. And we figured out that what we need to do is basically build a very scalable system and something of like an operating system to really get startup collaborations on everyone's desk. And that usually meant that instead of us being there and being like, hey, you should work more with startups, nobody cares. They need a very clear guideline. They need a way to understand, I am the manager of a production plant in the middle of nowhere. I have these, and these issues. How do I get to a solution? Who's going to fund it? And what's the process? And this is not a plug because we work with you, but it is a plug because we basically use Glassdoor software to really have a system where there's a lot of input. Basically, every employee is encouraged all the time to go there and say, I have this problem, and they have to answer 2 short questions, and then they already get like AI recommendations, but we get an information where it basically says, okay, this is a processing plant, this is a customer case where they have a problem, and then us from the central team, we reach out to them and we're like, how can we help you? Do you have budget? Should we co-finance this? Is it just a pilot? Is it really something that a startup can solve? Like, building these systems is way more important than actually having an innovation team that does that continuously annoys people, but really systematizing it.
So is it fair to say that you see yourselves very much as an enabler for the entire organization to find and test new solutions?
I would say I feel sometimes like a lobbyist. I feel like what people do in Brussels or in Germany, I run around and then we kind of, and I have to say we're lucky, we have the management board backing. They're very much pushing us to work with startups, and they're like, you should work with startups. But then again, what the managing board says and what the people who actually run the plans, design the products, there's like 12 letters of org codes in between, and in a lot of cases, they don't even care who you're at the top. They just want to optimize their one problem. And so in that sense, when I say we're a lobbyist, then I mean we do a lot of internal campaigns where we explain what are the benefits of venture clienting. We do a lot of enablement sessions where we're like, okay, you have a problem. How do you frame the problem? So yes, we enable it, but we also tell the world that smart people nowadays tend, and this is not the good standing for corporates, but smart people go and start their own companies. I think 10 years ago, you went to McKinsey and Bain and you were like, oh, look at me, I'm a consultant. 20 years ago, you went to one of the corporates. And nowadays, everybody who has more than 3 brain cells starts a company and does something. So we need to use this. So I'm lobbying that Siemens does this more.
Mm-hmm. I feel that's also really something big that has changed over the last 10, 20 years as this topic became more defined. One, the belief of innovation teams in the past felt very much like my business units can't do it themselves. They need us. Whereas now it's much more, okay, actually not all business units maybe are open to it, but there are quite some, and ultimately I believe in them because they're the experts in the space. And with that, I feel also that the focus of communication has changed from to the external world, making sure that all startups know that they can now work with corporate XYZ, much more to the internal world, where on the outside we're not realizing it, but on the inside we're actually seeing, wow, now within Siemens, probably the penetration of people that know that Siemens for Startups exists and that this is support that they can get, you have made massive progress on.
It's super interesting that you bring this up because we do also care that startups on the outside world know what we do, for the simple reason that Siemens is in so many like niche domains, like wastewater disposal. Like the market in wastewater disposal is super small, and if you're a startup there, please talk to us if you do wastewater. But there's so many of like these niche things where we want to make sure that startups know we're a partner. But the big question is like, we always set the goal that 80% of white collar workers should know that it is a good thing to work with startups. I don't know if we're at 80% because it's very hard to measure, but we're doing really a lot of like internal campaigns to make sure that people know about it. And also like getting management to sometimes get one of our managing board members to sit with a startup. And we, for example, have an Inventors of the Year award every year where someone who has done a very interesting project with a startup gets invited with the management board to have a dinner and talk about this. And Inventors of the Year is a good example. It was always for people who had the most paid patents in a year, or like the most groundbreaking patent. And now it's 2 awards where one is still for the patents, but one is for the best startup collaboration. And it's just like little things that we're pushing step by step so that the average Joe and Joina in Siemens think more of startups.
How many people work at Siemens actually?
About 300,000.
How many of those would you say are white collar?
Hard to tell, like 50K?
50K. So 50K people you need to actually reach.
That's the goal.
What have been the ways in which you've been able to do this most successfully?
So one of the things that we also kind of use from your software, again, not a plug, but we just, being honest, we use it, is what we kind of figured out is like people think of themselves to work at Siemens, but more than that, they think of themselves as working. I am an expert in simulation software. That's their thing. They've been doing this for 40 years. They're tier 1 engineers in this. They don't care about the trains we also built and the grid and whatever. And giving these people like targeted impulses from the startup market really helps. So often we send them either lists or like some sort of newsletter where you use your data to basically tell you, look, there's these 5 new companies. Venture capital fund A has invested 70 million. Here's a demo, and here's one of our customers who are also working with them. It gives this internal pressure a little bit to be like, I know you're Siemens, but there's more out there in the world. So data really helps us as well to, how do I say the word? Push people in a friendly way to think of the outside world. Because as Siemens, we tend to, as a corporate, you forget this. You're so caught up in your own thing that you forget that there is life outside.
I hear you. I think it's also very much about meeting them where they're at, right? Like, I don't care about startups necessarily. Like, what I care about is optimizing my quarterly results within that one space that I'm in.
Yep.
If you can be relevant for me there, I'll talk to you. If not, not. If you come to me and say, do something with startups, it's a very long thought process to realize, okay, how is this actually going to help my quarterly results? If instead you say, this competitor did this collaboration with this particular company that had that outcome, all of a sudden, I don't care if this is now a startup or not. It is validated for me that this is relevant.
See, there is a little bit of what I want to add on this, and that's a lot of, like, we're a company of engineers. And often you would have a certain project demanded by a customer, and the R&D teams would say, hell no, that's not going to happen. And then often the reality that then we start talking to a startup, and a startup says, but we can make it happen in 6 weeks. We often end up working with the startups. I will be honest, in some cases we do not end up working with the startups, but it does also help for internal culture change to be like, come on, if 3 guys can achieve this, how can this whole organization not achieve it? It's like, it is part of the culture change, so I think that's also very important for us. Mm-hmm. But startups are our friends, so it's a very thin line between making this like an enemy picture, like you will be replaced by externals. It's a very thin line, so we sometimes also went too far in that direction. It's a thin.
I hear you. We went a bit into the particular messaging towards those business units, but if you talk a bit about your team structure, right, especially with this very decentralized organization that you have otherwise, like what type of roles exist within your innovation team, and how many of them sit within those different roles?
So again, what makes Siemens very special is we have, we're such a broad organization, you will never have people who know everything about what we do. So what we're trying to push very hard is to have sort of, we call them, in our venture teams, basically people who are mandated to also look for problems, look for customer cases within their special niches. And then on every business unit level, we basically have teams that work with us on corporate together that really execute the POCs, figure out, does this make sense? Is this is this really a problem that needs to be solved? Is a startup the right solution? IP is a topic that we shouldn't forget. Sometimes we have a great startup solution, but it's just core IP of Siemens. Like if we externalize this in the future, we either need to buy the company or we're going to have a liability. So it's these types of discussions where we also need to support in the bigger strategy. But what we also do, and what's a bit different, is we use venture clienting or startup collaboration to go to customers as well. So what we often do is you would have a BMW who are building a new plant, and they're like, look, our plant runs on Siemens automation, but there's these three things we want. Can you deliver them? And in many cases, we then go to startups and we're like, hey, point cloud automation, you're good at this, help us. And then we kind of basically have joint go-to-market agreements with startups. So that's the sales organization is very important in this as well.
Mm-hmm. When you how do you report your impact, or how much you have done the last year?
The favorite question of every manager. Yeah. I mean, we have everything in a tool. So especially for venture clienting, it's very straightforward. We just see how many POCs did we do, how much money did we save, or how much sales enablement did it do? Because in some cases, it's not about saving money. It's about, which deals did we land because we were able to have a certain configuration, because we're a B2B company. So for that part, it's pretty easy. And then the bigger question is, like, when it comes to the customer projects, we really need to push our salespeople to also resell startup solutions, even though that's not classical venture clienting, but they need to be like, okay, we cannot offer this, but we can offer this. And I'm going to talk to the startup team so they help me find a startup in Grenoble, because the factory is there that can solve a certain issue. So that part, the sales part, is still very hard to track, but generally we're very happy with how many things are happening. But we still find out through you often about startup collaborations that we've never heard of, and we really make a lot of marketing. So,
do you actually have a central database where you know who you worked with or who is already a supplier? If now, as a business unit, let's say I'm walking around here and I found 3 interesting startups. How would I figure out if Siemens already has any relationship with them, apart from just asking them, which is always a bit embarrassing if you need to do that?
So funnily, we didn't discuss this question before, but I did exactly that. Namely, when I talk to startups today that are interesting, we use your tool, the Glassdoor software, and we basically see, did anyone at Siemens talk to them? Because everybody who works with startups knows that it's the tool that we use. So every conversation, every pitch deck, every email we see in the tool what kind of interactions that we have. And in some cases, it happens that I talk to a startup and I'm like, you sound amazing. And then we see that 3 teams already talked to them and they said the technology doesn't hold up. We sometimes have the opposite case where I'm like, this is a great startup and we use the tool to forward it. But having one place and not email, because email is the enemy of corporates, but specifically in this case, enemy of anything scalable. Because if we want to scale this, we need an operating system.
Yeah, I also feel that that definitely contributes to the cyclical death and rebirth of innovation teams, that if some central people that hold this knowledge in their inboxes or in their mind just leave, then all of a sudden all the previous work from the previous years is pretty much lost. Taking one step, going one step more meta again, what role does venture clienting play in your larger innovation efforts? You, for example, said before that you guys are revamping your CVC structure, for example.
I mean, a lot of these things are, as you said, there is the cycles of hype, of innovation and innovation theater, and quite often we're very, very skeptical of all the new things that come up. But, we can call it venture clienting, we can call it all of this, but the reality is venture capital is going into startups, and the smartest people are going into startups. And the only way how we can have that multiple that you describe, correlation, causation, whatever, is if we work with the smartest people outside of the room, and our job as a corporate team is just to make sure that Siemens works as much as possible. And obviously there is CVC, which, especially when we talk about AI and some of the big tickets, you need a seat at the table. If you need to invest if you want a seat at the table. There are some other mechanisms, but if you look at like the bread and butter, then venture clienting really just works because it's so little effort for quite a lot of impact, and it's just very scalable. Because in the end, let's be honest, it is just a very well-structured startup optimized supply process. But that's something, we buy things all the time as a corporate, so we're just optimizing that part to make sure it scales. So it plays a very big role, I would say.
That's, by the way, been the best framing that I found about venture clienting when you talk about people to people outside of this bubble. What venture clienting is finding and validating new suppliers. That's it.
Outside of the traditional ones.
Yeah, of course, right? Like we know how to work together with the Siemenses and SAPs, but let's make sure that we adopt the next SAP early, and especially then also can influence their roadmap of how they're developing, because we're a major customer of theirs. And that, by the way, on the other hand, then is we've spoken about it before. We have a lot of VCs that come to you, that come to us, saying, "Hey, you know the startup products that work. Can you not please share those?" Right? Which is a huge asset that you yourself also have. If we look at, okay, there are thousands of new solutions that you've tried out. That is an insight that no VC can ever generate, and you theoretically should be able to systematically turn into investment alpha.
That's the plan.
Very nice. I'm asking lots of questions. I'm wondering, we have about 4.5 minutes left. If there are any questions from the audience or any topics that you would like for us to dive deeper into. Daniel, Lufthansa Innovation Hub.
Happy to take one, thank you. You mentioned how you engage internal stakeholders, how you kind of push ideas to your internal stakeholders. How often does whatever you're pushing, how do you push it? In what format? I'm sorry. Thank you. I wasn't waiting for you. So sorry about that.
Now you have to repeat your question, I think.
I can do that. That's not an issue. So you mentioned before that you are obviously doing outreach to internal stakeholders, also suggesting maybe potential startups that might be of interest to that department, to that business unit. How do you do that concretely? Because how often do people, if it's via email or whatever program, not read stuff? So how do you actually ensure that the information you share at least lands? Whether it's then follow up on, it's something different. But what is your experience on, do actually people respond? And have you found a good format, a good way of connecting to business leaders, business unit leaders to talk about those startups that you're proposing?
So I think it's a two-tier problem. One is the individual employees that would work with a startup need to have kind of the green light from the top that it's okay to work with startups. So we need to make sure that the business unit TI heads, like technology innovation heads, they've given them the signal, you should work with startups, it's your job, it's important, whatever. So they need like the cultural green light, and we do that a lot with, honestly, just annoying the communication people of the business unit heads for such a long time until they do a webcast with us or like a Yammer post or whatever. So that's the green light where you should work. And then what we do, that when we use the Glassdoor software, all the applications, all the startups that come in, we look at them. If they're relevant to us, we really go through the organizational. We have a team that only does this, through the organizational diagram. And we're like, okay, this is like quantum simulation software. They have some good VCs. This looks like a good startup. Here are the 9 departments that work with this. And through time, we almost always know someone from that department. And we're like, hey, we think this might be a very good company. You have 14 days to please tell us if you want to set up a first call with them to see something. So from the top, the green signal, and then we really do the hands-on work with annoying people. Here's a startup, please look at it. And then, because usually with time, like we've done this for a couple of years, we know the individuals that are more open to it, and then we kind of go through them.
What we've also...
No, please.
I see there are more questions and we don't have so much time, so let's go into it.
Thank you. I'm coming from the energy sector. I was wondering, once you interact with the startup, you immediately push their value. Mm-hmm. So do you take this into account when closing a deal with them?
Interesting question, because as of today, Our CVC is a financial VC, so that's usually not an issue. Like the Venn diagram is very, very small. We do know that sometimes startups go the extra mile to work with us because putting a Siemens logo in the pitch deck is going to increase the value. We're aware of it, but there's also not that much that we can do because in the end, it's usually we have motivated suppliers and they're great partners, so it doesn't really impact our strategy.
Thanks for the presentation and the discussion. How do you ensure that you can keep as Siemens a startup as a supplier, even if the startup is acquired by another company?
That is one of my nightmare questions, I will tell you. Because we had cases like this. I mean, to be honest, it doesn't happen super often. Because if they get acquired, that's usually not that much of a problem. If they get acquired by a competitor, that's a problem. And we had cases where that happened, but I would say out of, 500 something collaborations we've done, it happened like 1.5 times. So it's a risk we need to plan for, but it's something that's just part of the game. There's no obviously you have legal work that can figure all of this out, but in the end, you don't want to enrich your competitors. So it's something that we have to keep in mind, but it usually doesn't happen that often, so my nightmare doesn't come often true, but there is no simple answer to it, I'll give you. Especially with the IP versus core IP discussion, it gets very tricky.
And what does happen plenty, I can say, both at Siemens as well as others. Like I know from Bosch, for example, the number is about 10 to 20% of the companies they run a POC with. They actually also invest into them. So generally, at least you're sure that you had all the information to theoretically be the one that does the acquisition. And if then you haven't done it, well, then maybe also it wasn't as interesting or as bad of a case.
Yeah.
There's a follow-up on that.
I'm sorry, I have to disagree with what you have said. You know that the CVC of Bosch, if Bosch has invested as a CVC, they never acquired the company.
Indeed, the CVC might not, but if you have shares in the company, then taking the next step of actually then doing the full acquisition is much easier, no? From a separate entity then. Sorry?
Interesting.
I think I could give you 1 or 2 examples where it has. But also, I think Bosch was also right on the among the top 10. Also there, we're talking about thousands of collaborations happening via all kinds of different teams, right? And I think also there again, it's a big argument for having some sort of centralized knowledge base where you actually do know about what existing collaborations or relationships exist, including also then those investments. Okay, I think that is it for the time that we had. If you're interested in the data that I shared before and much more sector-specific analyses, here's the link. It's available for free. We don't even ask you for your email. Feel free to read it, and we're super grateful about feedback. We know there's a lot more that can still be uncovered. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.